Thanks for sticking around here this late. Wasn't Dr. Melillo fantastic earlier today? You know, he actually, as he talked about, wrote a book for the lay public called Disconnected Kids. And the Zach Brown Band, the Carrick Institute, tons of people are starting to read this and find out that their kids can benefit from the type of care that you have to offer. He also wrote for you, for the doctors, for not the lay public, Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood. Yeah, it's a mouthful, we know, but it has about 4,500 references to back it up and everything that he says. Some of the studies that he's published recently, let me back up. Did you know he actually spoke at MIT recently? The Artificial Intelligence Department asked him to speak for them, to them, about the type of work that we're all doing, the type of work that Dr. Melillo is doing. Because the Artificial Intelligence Department is not that great at creating artificial intelligence. We can get computers to run, but we can't get good feedback to the body, the robot itself, back up to the brain, because it's lacking something, and that is proprioception, in essence. When we have that every day of our lives, we were born with that, we develop it throughout our lifetime. And the Artificial Intelligence Department asked him to speak about the research that they're doing. So what type of research are they doing? Well, first of all, in the Acta Pediatrica, which is basically a pediatric journal, last year they published a research study showing that basically ADHD kids have a slower and lower functioning right brain, with EEG studies, basically measuring the electrical output of that. Versus when they study dyslexic children who tend to have a left brain problem because reading is a left brain activity, it was weaker on that side. So in his description of all this, it's not that an autistic or an ADHD or an Asperger's child or a dyslexic child has per se damage to the brain. There's not degeneration of the brain, and it's not a genetic problem. It's kind of like having two computers. One of them runs on Windows 95, and I've got one of those. Now, I have a computer that runs on Windows 7. How well would it work if I tried to hook them up? I haven't tried because I know it wouldn't work. They work fine independently of each other. But if you tried to hook them up in a network, they just wouldn't function. So what can we do as functional neurologists to help to improve this? Well, there's entire centers that are opening up, and doctors are specializing in autistic conditions. In fact, in the Review of Neuroscience 2009, they talked about that autism, basically the title of the entire paper was Autism as FDS, Functional Disconnection Syndrome. Last year it made the newswire. It was on all types of different news channels. It was the first universal theory of autism that could explain how children could have decreased functions but also increase in certain functions, because the whole vaccine theory doesn't explain why they might have an improvement in reading ability and verbal recall, but poor comprehension skills. Comprehension is more of a right brain activity, and left brain is actual verbal, reading, writing, arithmetic. So they've been building up the right brain through certain activities, testing, treatment, movements, rehabilitation, and again, it became very famous and very popular, and there are now thousands of children that are benefiting from this type of care. Like I mentioned, the Zach Brown Band. I just saw a picture of him today holding up the Disconnected Kids in his concert, because he has actually donated the money he won from certain awards to the Carrick program, who is doing work like this to help to bring up whichever side of the brain is not quite firing like the other side. So Dr. Carrick mentions it as a hemisphericity. Dr. Johnson mentions it as a hemisphericity, meaning one side is dominant, one side is weak. And if you're constantly just trying to bring down one side, like they often do with medication, or they're looking at other problems, and they're trying to find it from a genetic perspective, then you're missing out on some of this. Because if you follow the genetics, you can't have an explosion of genetic problems. Okay? Genes don't change that fast. If you look at Time magazine from January of this year, it's basically genetics versus environment. And did you know that you can actually change the epigenetics? You can change how the genes function. You can turn on or off segments or individual genes without actually changing the gene itself. Time magazine, January this year, has a fantastic article about that. And if you read through that, you'll basically see that it's the major discovery of this generation, which if you read Bruce Lipton, who teaches he's running around out in Southern California. He was from the University of Wisconsin, basically instructing the medical students first year, getting them up to speed with the science. That if you read his work from 20 years ago, he was talking about epigenetics, that you are not your genetics, you are not your genes. He had a title of his book called "It's the Environment, Stupid." Just like it's the economy, stupid, the whole Bill Clinton line. Well, these researchers went and published a paper a year after he wrote his book called "It's the Ecology, Stupid." And of course they took credit for it, but epigenetics has been around forever. So it's not just the actual genes that you're passing on to your children, it's the expression of these genes. And then also, it can be food allergies and food toxicities and chemical environmental issues. Just last week they published a paper about how pesticides on foods can trigger ADHD type syndromes. And when I talk about this, I am obviously speaking about it as if it were one continuous type spectrum where they're all related. Because if you look at it closely enough, you can see that they're pretty much all related. Right brain, left brain function. Frontal, parietal lobe dysfunction. Allergies, sensitivities, food sensitivities. Reactions to pesticides, to chemicals, things like this. So we're going to talk about this over the next hour. But before we get started, I just want to know if anyone has any questions before I get a little bit too detailed about it. Yes?